Political culture tends to put the boundaries around where exactly they can go. And that culture continually shifts and it moves back and forth. But the number one error people, especially politicians and many times my political science colleagues make, is that they think elections are somehow going to either impact or perfectly reflect those shifts in culture.
Many people are likely looking at our government and thinking, I didn't vote for this. People often point out that the government doesn't accomplish things that serve the popular interests and lament that the system is broken. However, the contradiction between the popular will on the one hand and unpopular policy on the other raises an interesting question about what exactly is the popular will and to what ends does it serve. Joining us today is Dr. Ryan Yonk. He's a senior research faculty here at the American Institute for Economic Research, and he specializes in political science. Ryan has published many papers on everything ranging from voter behavior to interest group politics, making him perfect to explain from an analytical perspective why our politics are so strange today. So Ryan, I want to start off with almost like a metaphysical question that's really been bugging me. So I hear from my Democratic friends that if we just get enough people out there to vote, Democrats win. And my Republican friends will say the vast majority of this country is actually quite conservative and the Democrats are out of touch and they've hijacked our institutions. And then my libertarian friends keep telling me, even though we've gotten less than 3% of the vote maximum, that the majority of the country is actually libertarian. They just don't know it. So given all these contrasting claims about the quote-unquote popular will, is it even fair to say that America votes for essentially what it wants all the time, or is there something bigger at play?
Well, so I think there's a couple of things in response to that, Ethan, that I would suggest that they're all right and they're all wrong, because the notion of a popular will, which is particularly popular in sort of democratic theory realms, particularly from those like Rousseau, who talked about these underlying ideas. And somehow we could simply tap into what the general will is, which was the Rousseauian claim, that we could then arrive at good government. And from that, the democratic theorists built even further and suggested that the question was one of an allocation mechanism. Is how could you structure allocation in such a way that we could then, through some procedure, reveal what the general will is. The problem in all that is that democratic elections, by their very nature, are static instances of a single moment in time and include only those who actually participate in the electoral process. And so on the one hand, it's correct that they do represent the will of the people with regards to a specific candidate. But a specific candidate within the context of who the other candidate was, the situation at the time, the ongoing political fights. But that may not hold next week or next year or tomorrow. And so the decision mechanism, rather than being some sort of wholly revelatory approach to understanding the world, instead is just what I described, a decision mechanism. Because functionally, for government to work, for democracies to function, you have to have a way of deciding. And elections are that procedure. They tend to work actually fairly well. They're relatively stable. They do aggregate information, but they don't necessarily reveal some greater truth. They're not a truth-seeking endeavor. They're a decision-making endeavor.
And so when we talk about, for example, the midterms just passed and sort of there's a shift from the House being majority Democratic to now more Republican, is that sort of an illustration that, the last midterms, the country swung more blue, now it's swung more red. So what you're saying is like, one time voters might have thought another thing, but for some reason, based on current events, they just shifted their opinions, and this shift in parties is just kind of representing that.
Yeah, so I think it's actually far more sort of mechanistic than that, because rather than it being that elections are somehow swapping back and forth this revealed notion of truth or the decision-making process, what we really can look at and say is that over the course of the electoral cycle, and as the decisions were being made, the total number of representatives in Congress that affiliate with one party changes based on the electoral circumstances, the candidates that are involved, the issues. And so politicians, particularly winning politicians, like to claim a mandate, claim that somehow they have now been granted this greater insight or greater support because the selection mechanism selected them or their party to be in control based on the set of rules that we have. Now, there's nothing about the set of rules we have that are particularly, they don't emerge from some natural law. They emerge from principles that we can find in natural law about individual liberty, individual decision-making, and those sorts of things. And they're simply allocation mechanisms. They're mechanisms by which we decide who will actually hold office, who will make decisions, and in many ways, it's far more practical than this grand truth-seeking endeavor that sometimes people, especially politicians, like to describe it as.
And when you talk about essentially an allocation mechanism, so you're essentially setting up that there's a lot of things we can get done privately, like most things like baking bread or like making the water run, but there's some things that we need essentially as a society to figure out, whether that's like healthcare or law and order, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. I think that any number of those things could be handled through different allocation mechanisms. By its nature, when government emerges, and typically government first emerges and then is planned, we're clearly very much in the plan side of what government looks like. And the plan is that allocation mechanism. It says we are going to have government, and now we're going to have a mechanism by which we select those who will govern. In the United States, of course, our system operates in the form of a republic, meaning that we will select representatives that will then make decisions about how to govern. How much they govern, in what areas, those are inherently political decisions that are made after the initial allocation. And in fact, Buchanan and Tulloch, James Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner, and his longtime co-author Gordon Tulloch, who is also an economist, write about this pretty extensively. And they write about the notion of constitutional political economy as being foundational to our ability to understand the rest of political economy. Because that initial allocation mechanism, and I talk about it like an allocation mechanism on purpose, because all it's doing is allocating power. And here we choose to allocate power through that republic, through the Republican system, involving elections, with power divided across branches. We now start to get into basic civics that hopefully Americans are being taught. I'm not sure they all are, but it's the basic civics that Americans are taught. And the American system divides power both vertically and horizontally, meaning that the federal government isn't in charge of everything, and no single branch is in charge of everything. And as a result, the way in which those decisions happen change the ebb and flow of politics, which of course then has practical implications for what government chooses to do or to not do.
And you hear people toss around the word political culture a lot. And so I'm interested in your perspective of, you laid out a very institutional argument. Do you think political culture or institutions explains why, America's more freedom loving, don't touch my guns, get out of my, whatever, and maybe like a country like France, a bit larger government, a country like England, maybe a bit larger government. How much do you think political culture explains why voters vote for what they do?
Well, so culture matters quite a lot. And I wouldn't draw a hard distinction between political culture and general culture. In fact, I think they're pretty well intertwined. When we think about what we mean by political culture, culture is the accumulated interactions of human beings making decisions across time. That's how culture develops. And a variety of different cultures develop, not just worldwide, but in the United States as well. You can move from region to region and you will identify different cultures. There are some things that unify American culture. That general view on self-reliance, independence, liberty, all those things are important. But they're not created by the political system. They, in fact, are what help to create and influence the political system. And as a result, we end up having boundaries around what is possible for government to do once we decide to, once we actually engage the voting process and select who will govern. Political culture tends to put the boundaries around where exactly they can go. And that culture continually shifts and it moves back and forth. But the number one error people, especially politicians and many times my political science colleagues make, is that they think elections are somehow going to either impact or perfectly reflect those shifts in culture. And instead, they're very much a lagging indicator of how culture has changed. If we take the 60,000-foot view, we can look and see how culture has shifted and how politics comes along behind it. If we go back 30 years and look at the issues that are on the table 30 years ago, the specific issues are not the same. The ideas that underlie those issues are still ongoing. And we can see the culture that's shifted in subtle ways that move the boundaries of what is or is not possible inside politics.
And so how would that explain maybe why California is one way, California tends to be more progressive, and Texas tends to be more conservative? Do you think there's more of a cultural element, or is that more so just the way like the institutional forces of politics play out?
So it's both. I would describe myself largely as an institutionalist, a public choice scholar who believes that institutions matter, that institutions have a relatively robust effect on how things will play out. By the same token, the development of Texas in terms of its culture versus the development of California, the repetitive sort of ongoing iterative effect leads to different sort of orientations. In part, you also have a self-selection issue going on, that you see a culture develop and you begin to move towards that culture. And so you move towards the things that you like about that culture is a better way to say it. And so that selection builds over time. And so we end up with these distinctions, both institutionally and culturally, that end up mattering. But again, culture is what's placing the boundaries around what politics can do. In form, only at the margins, institutionally, are Texas and California different. Only in the specifics of what exactly government can do are they different. If you look at the basic structure, they're both American states focused that use the English common law as its traditional root, use the statutes approach, and if you dig into it, you're going to find more similarity between the criminal and civil code of California and Texas than difference. The differences are real and they're important, but they're largely at the margin.
And I guess many Americans we always talk about the two-party system, why it is the way it is, and a lot of back and forth. What is your sort of theory on why there are just two political parties that both Americans seem to both hate?
Oh, well, I mean, the answer to why Americans a two-party system is simple. We have majority rule and single past the post election cycles. And so structurally, those institutions mean that because of the way in which it happens, you end up gravitating back towards two parties over time mathematically. I mean, this is relatively consistently borne out, that as soon as you introduce the institutions the United States uses, you start to see this coalition towards two parties. And the U.S. system is particularly that way because not only in each congressional seat do we select a single winner that is first past the post, geographically bounded, we also select a president based on those same basic rules as well, with the modification that they have to get a majority in the Electoral College. So now suddenly you are having to put together enough votes to win, and that pushes all of it towards two parties.
So it's more about creating coalitions that win rather than reflecting some more philosophical point about conservatism or libertarianism. It's all about.
So parties sometimes have ideologies that are affiliated with them, but political parties are pure and simple about winning elections. They hope many times that they're going to have an ideological impact or an impact on policy, but the job of a politician is to win elections, particularly when they're in the candidate mode. Sometimes they switch into governing mode, but the modern reality is that doesn't happen very easily, because you have to, in fact, continually run for re-election, particularly if you're in the House. You'll notice senators tend to have something slightly different, and second-term presidents have something different as well. But that the reality of the continual run for office means that they're in candidate mode, and therefore they're focused on collecting enough votes to win. And that's fundamentally what drives them. And our hope in the American system, and this is really, I think, in part the genius of the American system, is that in order to collect enough votes, you have to convince enough people, individuals voting in their home district, individuals voting for president, that in fact what you claim you're going to do aligns with them. That's a great hope. In reality, parties have become proxies for sets of policy bundles that people expect that they're going to try to implement, sets of values that they're continually going to fail at. But ultimately, that's the great hope. That's the logic of why we do this, is we're trying to get to something that resembles what the people want.
So what exactly would be the idealized version of the Congress people are in for only X amount of years, so they're constantly in what you say campaign mode. Ideally, you'd think that's a good thing, as in they're constantly trying to get the popular will. What exactly is the reality? Like, what they're in campaign mode, what has influenced them, and why is it not just the popular will in the abstract?
Yeah, the sort of funny line from political science is that they act as though they are single-minded seekers of re-election. That comes out of the literature in political science. And the political scientist in me then wants to say, but of course we know they're not just single-minded seekers. And that's, I think, largely right. But re-election is always in the back of their mind. And in fact, the system was designed in many ways so that it would be at the back of their mind, particularly for members of the House of Representatives. That in fact, the People's House, as the framers like to call it, was meant to be a place where it was continually on their mind whether or not they were going to be reselected to go back. And so as a result, I'm actually a fairly hard opponent of term limits for a host of reasons, not the least of which is the continual campaigning isn't a deviation from the system as it was set up. In fact, it was hard baked into the system. It was meant to be part of what was going on. Now, the framers were very concerned about the problems of faction, the idea that you would have splinters within the new American system that would make it impossible for them to come to decisions that would benefit the country as a whole. But they wanted them tied back to the people. And at the same time, they were deeply concerned about that reality. And so you'll notice they set up the rest of the elected parts of government to sever that connection. The president isn't elected directly. Senators were not elected directly. There was the balance that was going on. And that balance, rather than representing some revealed truth, is about the practicalities of the allocation mechanism and the selection of how government will run.
And of course, we can't jump into the mind of all the framers, but in your opinion, did they establish a liberal democratic constitutional republic? Essentially, was voting implemented to preserve and advance liberty, or was voting more so a recognition that society has all these various preferences that it needs to figure out one way or another?
So I think that's a very modernist take on how to frame the question. So remember, the framers had a couple hundred years of experience in self-government behind them at the time of the Revolution. Many of the as you were dealing with the colonies that were set up in the New World by Great Britain, the charters issued initially to Virginia and to the companies that helped establish them granted immense self-government rights. So too with what was going on in New England at the same time. And in fact, part of what went on was this grand experiment in self-government, that in fact, the major sort of disagreement that emerges in the revolutionary period, we often frame it as being around taxes, but fundamentally it was a question of how involved Great Britain was going to be in the colonies. And in fact, the taxes became the flashpoint because it was in the direct sort of involvement of the mother country into the realm, where now what had been largely left to them to govern was now in theirs. And they had governed largely in that period through selection mechanisms through elections. And in fact, it had become expected that there would be elections. It was true in Great Britain at the time as well. It was Parliament had developed a robust and important role, and so there was long-run experience with it. And so it was. It wasn't. I don't believe it was a question of we're going to do something new in order to attempt to solve these problems. In fact, I think they would have referred to it as a very fairly conservative revolution. That in fact, what you've done is you've taken these things, and therefore we want them back. And the only way we're going to get them back, because we can't trust you, is by severing the relationship. There were more radicals. There were radicals that wanted to sever it for a whole host of other reasons. And in fact, we mostly read the radicals. But within the founding generation was this group that was focused on a deep concern about the change that they were seeing. So we remember Sam Adams. We remember that part of the founders as being firebrands. We often don't remember the Eldridge Garys and others that ultimately arrive at revolution as the solution, but we're seeking to return something back to what they had come to expect.
So we mostly focus on the Jeffersons and the Adams, who fundamentally want to make a new free country, change the world, but in reality, there was just a lot of people that didn't like what was going on. They wanted to preserve the status quo, and England was actively changing it, making things worse, taking away their rights.
They wanted to preserve what they perceived as the status quo. And I think that's an important piece to put in there. And I'm not entirely certain that that ultimately we couldn't even classify Jefferson and John Adams into that category, because they were, if you read Jefferson is going to pen the Declaration of Independence, and we read the first part. We don't read the second part, which is the list of grievances. And the grievances, you'll notice, are not entirely, but are primarily things that had changed in how the crown was interacting with the colonies. If you read them in detail, taken away this, taken away that, all those sorts of things. And so in many ways, that's part of what's going on. And the result from that is that we end up seeing we see not the invention of a democratic system, but the adoption of previous principles that are then put together in a unique way to try to prevent some of the problems that happened. And that's really the innovation of the founders, is the construction of competitive power within a system that then binds the system both together and prevents any single part of it from dominating. And that's, I think, the innovative part. And and it's also part of what creates the modern political dilemma we have of parties and of partisanship.
And so that's definitely a more like scientific way of looking at it, rather than a sort of schoolhouse rock, we love our country, it's all, all to forward liberty sort of way. I want to get into a little bit more into like sort of like those scientific components. Sure. When you're talking about different interest groups, incumbents. You mentioned you essentially alluded to political entrepreneurs, of people who like essentially recognize the system and then leverage it for various ends. So I read some of your papers on, you use the term political entrepreneurs. So can you actually explain that term, and how does that exactly relate to American politics?
Yeah, so political entrepreneur is not a term that I coined. It's a very well established term in sort of the political economy literature. I and my co-authors, Deanna Thomas and Randy Simmons, which is, I'm assuming that's the paper you read, right? Conceived of political entrepreneurs as operating very much like a traditional entrepreneur in the Kersnerian sense. So a Kersnerian entrepreneur is scanning the horizon, looking for opportunities. And then when they identify an opportunity, they act. That's the basics of what Kersnerian entrepreneurship looks like. For us, we say within the political system of the United States, there are actors that are doing the same thing, that are scanning the policy horizon and the institutions and identifying opportunities to achieve something they want. Whether that's getting a policy thing they want, whether it's and getting an advantage. They're scanning the horizon, and they know both the institutions and and sort of the boundaries. And as they scan, they then take action. And so a political entrepreneur, for us, looks essentially like the Kersnerian entrepreneurship, the Kersnerian entrepreneur just operating not inside the marketplace, operating inside a different set of institutions, which we call government and the political sphere.
And so what are some examples of these political entrepreneurs, and how do they really swing American politics and policy in the direction that some people might be thinking about?
Yeah, so we love to sort of abuse lobbyists, and rightly so. I mean, in part because they are political entrepreneurs. They are continually scanning the horizon, identifying where they can get advantage, typically for clients of them. They're professionals at this, and they're scanning to say, okay, if we donate to this committee member's campaign, they'll listen to us, and then we can present. And so they do that. They've scanned the horizon. But even more generally, political entrepreneurs will be looking to say, okay, it looks like the marginal cultural piece has now shifted and created an opening for us to be able to do this much more or this much less of something, and now's the moment. And so they're scanning and watching that horizon to do so. And you can see this pop up periodically. Honestly, the fight over the speakership, for as frustrating as Matt Gaetz and his cohort are, in many ways they were political entrepreneurs. They scanned the horizon. They can do simple math. They knew that if they didn't vote for Kevin McCarthy for speaker, he wasn't going to be speaker. Now, I think they made a miscalculation and thought they were going to get someone else. But a couple of them, and if you watch what happened, after we get into like the third and fourth day, you watch people start to peel off. And why they're peeling off is because they had scanned the horizon, they had taken the action, and then they were able to get what they wanted. It's a very crass example. So Chip Roy, for example, was one of them. He got policy changes to how the rules run in the House of Representatives as a result. He'd scanned it. He saw that if he took this action, he could potentially get what he wants. Major companies and industries do it. Environmental groups do it. They're scanning the horizon, and they're not just mechanized components. Because sometimes we forget that there are active components to the political system as well that are out there attempting to get what they want. And the entrepreneur is seeing a new opportunity. So an entrepreneur isn't somebody that walks in and says, so you're the committee on X that does this. You should allocate this money that already exists to me. That's just a player in the system. The entrepreneur walks into the committee and says, okay, the change in law you just made now makes it possible for us to do this, and here's what we would propose. They're creating something new through their activity based on the rules and the opportunities that they see. And so we see that a lot from sort of those that are interested in new policies that were not possible before or that we're not able to get. And so lobbyists, as I said, we malign them a lot, but the best of them are those that are out there actually identifying the new opportunities for their clients.
And so I guess for an average voter's perspective, when you vote for someone, send them to Congress or whatever political branch you're sending them to, they had that general mandate like, oh, I was elected on this platform. But at the end of the day, you should expect them to essentially play to the set of rules that they didn't necessarily sign up for.
Well, they're going to respond to the incentives. Everybody responds to incentives. And the incentives that elected officials respond to are both electoral, they're institutional, and they're interpersonal. And so all those things are at play for an elected official, just like they're at play for any individual operating in their daily life. We have institutional things that influence us. We have reputational things, which would be where I would put the electoral side of it, because they want to be reelected. And we have interpersonal things that motivate us. And they're operating in the same realm. We all too often forget that we didn't elect a robot. We elected a person, and that person faces the same incentives that everyone does.
And from a sort of like, how did I get this policy perspective? So when people, vote for a conservative candidate and all of a sudden he's, voting against gun control or voting for gun control and all that kind of stuff. We hear the term bootleggers and Baptists a lot, and how that's sort of, these interest groups tend to crowd out what we would define as like the popular will per se. So like, what role do you think, or what do you think is sort of like that political science dynamic of bootleggers and Baptists versus like sort of like the majority opinion?
Yeah, so I think the root of the question you're asking is, how do we end up with weird outcomes? That's really where Baptists and bootleggers come from. Is how do two groups that should hate each other come together on a common policy? The classic example comes from Bruce Yandel when he was a regulatory economist working for the government, and he described something that is unique to many southern counties or southern cities, and that is many southern cities and counties are dry, or at least they were the period he was writing. And the question was, okay, why are they dry? Well, the easy answer is, well, they're nice religious Baptist folks. But when you start to dig into it, what keeps them dry across time? And there's a unique coalition that comes together in most of those counties that are pushing for it. So bootleggers who are making illicit alcohol have an interest. They're not particularly interested in the county having legal sale of alcohol. Why? Well, because if you can buy good alcohol, or you're buying bootleg alcohol, they're going to be cut out of the marketplace. At the same time, the Baptists don't want alcohol, and so they like the moral statement of saying alcohol is not legal in this county. And those two groups end up coming together and wanting the same policy outcome, which is no alcohol, no legal alcohol in the county. And we see this play out over and over again. And the arrangement almost always follows the same pattern, which is you have a pecuniary direct interest where the bootleggers don't care about the morality of alcohol. They're concerned that they'll be pushed out of the marketplace, who then come together with the Baptists, who have a moral sort of position. And the Baptists and the bootleggers come together to do it. And often what's happening is the Baptist is providing cover for the bootlegger. This is almost always the case in places when you hear somebody talking about, we should change policy X because of the children. You dig very deep, you're going to identify an interest that wants the policy that is now linked up with the moral group. They happen all the time. And the question then is, how on earth do they come together? Because they're not natural allies. In fact, they typically hate each other. And in fact, if you dig into some of the more complicated regulatory ones, especially in environment, they'll have said mean things about each other. A political entrepreneur, on the other hand, is who steps into the middle and says, your interest, you both want the same thing. I'm not going to be able to get you to work together necessarily for it. Maybe I can, but probably not. But I can see the opportunity, and if we get a policy that you both can support, we're more likely to get the outcome. And so it brings them together to create strange bedfellows. You end up having the bootlegger and the Baptist both supporting the same policy outcome. And so as a result, what you see is these coalitions that are a little bit, they look strange on the surface until you dig down into what the interests are and why they would need to come together. And often they come together because suddenly now the allocation mechanism is met by the supporters of the two groups.
So I want to end this discussion on the scientific component by touching on one last element, which is sort of more of a local politics perspective, which I think is probably the most interesting and funny one, especially if we want to talk about NIMBYs or I remember the other day we were talking about $50,000 allocated for Great Barrington Park benches. So
that was just a fun moment in a town meeting where in New England towns you have an open town meeting and the citizens can make motions from the floor. That happened this year here in Great Barrington. It's a great story.
So on that note, right? So why do we have interest groups that don't want people building anything and no development, no business development. Why are there these people at town hall meetings asking for $50,000 for park benches, right? So what are some of these mechanics that drive like these local policy-making decisions?
Well, I mean, ultimately, why do people go to government? It's a question of why do people go to government for what they want, and the answer is the same answer you get to when you ask the old pedantic question, why does a bank robber rob banks? And the answer to that question, of course, is, well, it's because that's where they keep the money. Fundamentally, that's also true of government. Why do people use government to try to prevent development? Well, because it can. Why do people go to town meeting and ask and want more park benches? Well, because government's the entity that can provide it. And so the reality is that the system we exist in is going to have the ability to perform some of those things. And the question is, do we expand the number of things government can provide, or do we limit it? Because we know people will go to government to do things, to get things they want, because it's where the money is. And fundamentally, that's ultimately the discussion of politics. There's a great quote from a political scientist that political science is the study of who gets what and when. I add the why to that, sort of in modern political science. But really, that's part of what we're studying, is who gets what, when, and why.
And then I guess I want to add another question on top of that. And we're seeing a fundamental shift in who votes for what political party in the United States. The Democrats used to call themselves, the multiracial coalition of like maybe the working class as well. And then the Republicans are more sort of like this conservative, white voting, more middle class, upper class. And now you're starting to see that Obama racial coalition break apart. People are now calling the Democratic Party like the coastal elite party. Now the Republicans are allegedly the working class party. So I guess in a really what is Ryan Young's theory about?
Well, I think your bias is showing a little bit there, because that is a textbook Republican description of the parties. The Democrats would, I think, have a very different sort of description. The reality is that parties have never been static in the United States, and in fact, one of the reasons why we can trace the continuity of the parties well back to, so we can trace the roots of the Democratic Party back to Jefferson, essentially. Not in ideas, not in ideology, but you can have this. You have a line that you can trace. Republicans you can trace back to Lincoln in 1860 and the founding of the Republican Party in 1856. But part of the reason why that's possible is because the coalition continually evolves in both parties. And in fact, we don't have to go very far back in time to identify a massive switch in the coalition in the Democratic Party. I mean, you only have to go back to the 1960s. And then in the Republican Party at that same time, you have the Southern strategy by Nixon that's going to accelerate the flip in the coalition in the Democratic Party. And now we've seen another sort of massive coalition. Political science, we call them realignments. They're only identified after the fact. In the middle of that, it's never clear what's going on. But it's clear to me we have a shift that's happening at the moment. What it will end up looking like, I don't know. Certainly, questions of populism are at the forefront in both parties. The Republicans have had the most press on this, but you also have a populist push within the Democratic Party. And those realigning forces, I think, are remaking the coalitions. And as a result, the parties may well end up looking and feeling very different 20 years from now. And in fact, the only thing I would say about the parties with any certainty is that if we transported ourselves 30 years into the future, so it's now 2050 or so, they will not be advocating the same things. The coalition will not be the same, and they'll have in some way be fundamentally different. But I'll predict there will still be two of them, two major parties, and they will be still arguing over the scope of what government should or should not be allowed to do. Just the policy areas will be different.
And I guess I want to end by asking sort of a looking forward question, which is, I'm sure many people, especially many of our colleagues, would say, look at what you just heard or what you just said and say, what a mess, right? This political thing, what a mess. Democracy, what a mess. And so perhaps like an anarcho-capitalist might say, this is why we need to privatize everything, abolish government. And then on the other extreme, you might have the Chinese government, which frequently says this is why you need a vanguard Leninist party to, do what's best for the people and avoid all the interest groups. So what is your solution, and where would you fall between that spectrum?
Democracy isn't magic, and government isn't magic. And sometimes we have this perception that they are. By the same token, the market isn't magic, and the Communist Party is certainly not magic. But the reality is that the hard questions that we should ask ourselves, I think, as citizens, is what are the bounds we wish to place on government, and how do we reinforce that those bounds get observed? And that's something that ends up being renegotiated, whether we like it or not, every generation or so. I tend to be someone who looks at it and says we should have very, very strict bounds on government. I think we actually see better outcomes in that. And that government should be doing a fairly narrow range of things. And it should do those things efficiently, hopefully effectively. I know I can't have either of those things in reality because all of the incentives push up against that. But fundamentally, I'm left with sort of the Winston Churchill sort of response to democracy, which is, it's the worst, but it's better than anything else we've identified. And I tend to think that as a whole, that's a fairly correct assumption about, especially sort of the American style system as how things operate. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is it messy? Absolutely it is. What would we replace it with that would be better? I can't identify that. And the natural restrictions on power hard baked into the American system prevent some of the worst outcomes from happening.
Well, on that, let's conclude what's been a great interview.
Thanks, Ethan.
Of course, and thanks for being on the show. If you really, really liked what you heard and you want to support more cutting-edge researchers like Ryan, make sure to become a donor. All that information and more can be found at aier.org. Thank you.